Let's in fact begin by giving you the top world reactions that have come in. The first being the NATO chief's statement, which has put it out there loud and clear, saying attack on one is like attack on all. French president has also reacted to the latest developments and in its first response calls it a turning point in European history. Earlier, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that we cannot and will not look the other way. This is a catastrophe for the European continent. And he even termed Vladimir Putin a dictator. Agency reports indicate that a Ukraine plane with 14 on board crashes near Kiev. Meanwhile, in another development, Vladimir Putin has welcomed Pak Prime Minister Imran Khan in Moscow. And back home in India, Ministry of Civil Aviation has now allowed passengers traveling from Ukraine to travel by transit under the India-Qatar bilateral air bubble, and that, of course, should facilitate the evacuation further. Remember, Ukraine envoy has appealed to PM Modi to use his power and influence over President Putin to stop this war. We're going to try and put things in perspective for our viewers. My colleague Archana is going to actually take us through the entire timeline of events because a lot has happened in the last 24 hours. Archana has done some research on where it all began and why this so-called catastrophe is happening right now. Archana?
Good evening, Afrida. Well, people must be wondering that Ukraine, which is a country of about 44 million people, why does it stand in this position that it stands attacked by Russia? And the contrast is, the irony is that Russia and Ukraine share a common culture. A lot of people speak Russian in Ukraine. So let's go back in time and tell our viewers what really happened there. So Putin, when he launched this military strike against Ukraine, he said that our aim is to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Now let's tell you how it started. So last year, in January 2021, Ukrainian president urged the US to include them in NATO. So NATO is an alliance of 30 countries. It's a defensive alliance of 30 countries. Now, when president of Ukraine asked Joe Biden to include them in NATO, this angered Russia. And Russia started deploying and training troops near Ukraine as a result of that. Now, I'll tell you why Russia is worried about it. What are Russia's worst fears after Ukraine urged Joe Biden to include it in NATO? The fear is of expansionism. Now, what is the reason is that Russia resists Ukraine's tilt towards NATO and EU. Russia believes that Ukraine is a puppet of the West. Russia also fears that if Ukraine joins NATO, then America's hold over Europe will increase. That is Russia's worst fear. And another important thing is that if Ukraine joins NATO, then it will recapture Crimea. So this is one of the worst fears of Russia, and which is why it led Putin to order a strike. Now, what does Russia want? They have a lot of demands. Now, like I said, Russia does not want Ukraine to join NATO. So it wants a legally binding pledge from Ukraine that it will never join NATO. It also wants an assurance from NATO that it will never include Ukraine in that defensive alliance of 30 countries that was formed after the Second World War. Now, Russia also wants Ukraine to demilitarize and become a neutral state. Like I said, it believes that Ukraine is a West puppet. Russia wants it to be neutral, doesn't want it to be a military state. Now, another important thing that Russia demands is that all of NATO and EU, they should stop deploying weapons near Russia. Like I said, everybody fears expansionism, and that is also Russia's fear that NATO's and EU's influence will increase, and that threatens Russia's position. So these are the key reasons. These are the worst fears of Putin, which have led him to attack Ukraine.
Archana, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for that amazing explainer, which put things in perspective for our viewers who have just joined us. They get an idea of what this entire issue is all about.